Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Please subscribe my channel. The boardroom at Heartrun Living was too bright. All fluorescent light bouncing off polished mahogany and the glass wall that overlooked downtown Chicago, making every face look a little harsher than it already was. My father, Richard Hart, stood at the far end of the table with a thick cream folder splayed open under one hand. My mother, Celeste Hart, sat straight-backed in a dove-gray suit, one manicured finger resting against the stem of her wineglass. My brother, Graham Hart, leaned against the credenza with his sleeves rolled to the forearms, jaw working slowly, a performance of injured disappointment already arranged across his face. Beside him, Martin Keller, the family attorney, adjusted his gold cuff links and avoided my eyes. Then my mother gave a soft little laugh and said, "You'll never be as good as your brother, Evelyn. But I didn't think you'd be stupid enough to steal from us too." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the assistant from finance, Nora Bell, froze halfway through setting a legal pad on the side table. Graham pushed away from the credenza and started circling toward me, slow and deliberate, his shoes striking the hardwood with the steady rhythm of a metronome. My father turned the open folder so the glossy printouts faced me. Bank transfers. Internal approvals. A screenshot of my company login. A vendor authorization with what looked at first glance like my signature. My name is Evelyn Hart. I'm 32. And this is the story of how I stopped begging my family to see my worth and made them watch what happened when they lost the one person who had been holding their empire together. My father flattened one palm against the folder. You diverted funds through Northline procurement and tried to cover it by deleting the approval chain. Graham exhaled through his nose, then shook his head as if I had personally disappointed him. I told them not to make this public, Evie. I said we should handle it privately. He always used that nickname when he wanted to reduce me. Evie. Small. Harmless. Contained. I looked at the documents without touching them. The paper smelled faintly of toner and expensive stationery. The company seal glinted at the top of each page. Somebody had put real effort into the staging. Martin Keller cleared his throat. If you cooperate now, we can keep this within the family. Cooperate how? I asked evenly. Exactly. My mother crossed one silk-clad leg over the other. You resign. You sign a statement admitting misuse of company access. You waive any claim to the Lake Bluff Trust distributions. And in return, we don't involve the police. Nora Bell sucked in a breath so quietly I almost missed it. There was not discipline. Not disappointment. Erasure. Graham moved to my side of the table and planted both hands on the chair across from me. You got ambitious, he said. You got sloppy. That's what happens when people want to be me. I finally looked up at him. His tie was loosened just enough to suggest stress. His watch caught the overhead light every time he flexed his fingers. He had spent his whole life learning how to look like the reasonable one while someone else bled. My father said, "Say something." "I'm thinking," I replied. That seemed to irritate him more than if I had cried. Celeste tilted her head. "Thinking won't help you now." Graham gave a short laugh. "Come on, Evelyn. Don't make this uglier than it needs to be." I turned one page. Then another. Then I set the packet down with absurd care, lining the edges against the table as though we were discussing upholstery samples instead of my future. "Is that all of it?" I asked, "or just the part you printed for the audience?" My father's face hardened. "Don't be clever." Martin Keller slid a document from his briefcase and placed it in front of me. "This is the resignation and mutual non-disclosure agreement. If you sign now, we can preserve a measure of dignity." I glanced at the signature line, then at the date. Today's date. Drafted at 8:14 a.m. Which meant they had finalized it after the copied login hit the server at 2:13. So they really had decided to do this today. Graham straightened. "You should be grateful. Dad wanted to destroy you." "Graham," my mother murmured, but there was no real rebuke in it. Only satisfaction. He shrugged. "What?" She should hear the truth for once. The truth. That word would have been funny in any other room. Nora Bell stepped back toward the wall, clutching her notepad to her chest. Martin Keller uncapped his pen and placed it neatly beside the contract. My father folded his arms. My mother watched me with that same patient superiority she wore at charity luncheons when someone had mismatched glassware. They thought I was cornered. They thought the years had taught me the lesson they always wanted me to learn. Lower your head, accept the insult, survive it quietly. said. I stood up. The leather of my chair gave a soft sigh as I pushed it back. Graham took half a step away, surprised by the movement. I smoothed the front of my navy blouse, picked up my water glass and took one unhurried sip. Then I looked at my mother and said, "If I'm never going to be as good as your son, then I suppose this is the part where you ask him to explain why he used my login at 2:13 this morning." Nobody moved. Not my father. Not Martin. Not Graham. I set the glass down so gently it barely made a sound. "And before any of you answer," I added, "you should know that everything from this morning has already been copied off-site." The air in the room changed. Not all at once. More like a pressure seal cracking. Graham blinked first. My father's shoulders tightened beneath his charcoal jacket. Martin Keller's pen stopped between his fingers. My mother's smile didn't disappear. "Yes, thinned." "You're lying," Graham said. "Am I?" He pushed away from the table. "You don't have access to the audit mirror." "No," I said calmly. "You revoked that in March." Which is what made it so interesting when my credentials suddenly reappeared at 2:11 a.m. My father's head snapped toward Graham. It was subtle. Barely a turn. But I saw it. Graham saw it too, which meant the first crack had already formed. I reached into my bag and took out my phone. Not with drama. Not with triumph. Just with the same measured patience I used when reviewing floor plans or construction bids. I unlocked it, tapped twice and placed it face up on the table between us. The screen showed a still image from security footage. Graham entering the executive floor at 2:04 a.m., his baseball cap low, his right hand gloved, the brushed steel elevator doors reflecting his outline in warped silver. Nora Bell whispered, "Oh my God." Graham lunged for the phone. I lifted it before his hand got there. "Careful," I said. "That reaction makes you look nervous." My mother stood so abruptly her chair legs scraped across the wood. "Where did you get that?" "From the security archive your son forgot I designed the storage permissions for." Richard Hart took one step toward Graham. "You told me you were home." Graham's jaw tightened. "I was handling a problem." Martin Keller finally found his voice. "Evelyn, if this is some kind of bluff." "It isn't." I met his eyes. "And if you'd like, Martin, I can also play the voicemail from last Tuesday where you advised my father to move quickly before she gets suspicious." That landed harder than the security still. Martin went gray around the mouth. My mother stared at him, then at my father. "Richard." My father ignored her. "What voicemail?" I let the question sit there between us for a second, heavy and gleaming. Then I smiled. Small. Polite. Ruinously calm. And for the first time in my life I watched my family realize I was not the person they had invited into that room. The next 10 minutes were not loud. That was the part that unsettled them most. I didn't scream. I didn't plead. I didn't demand an apology or throw accusations around like broken glass. I simply opened the files one by one and let the room do what rooms like that always do when truth is introduced without warning. It divided. First, I enlarged the security timestamp and slid the phone toward my father. Graham reached for it again. Richard slapped his hand away without even looking at him. Then I opened the server log export. Every login. Every credential shift. Every temporary access restoration. My name in blue. Graham's device ID in gray. The IP match from the executive suite access point. The digital trail was clean, clinical, impossible to charm away. Graham tried anyway. "She must have spoofed that," he snapped. "She knows the back end better than anyone." "Thank you," I said almost pleasantly. "That's actually very helpful." He faltered. "What?" "You just established that I know the system too well to leave a fraud trail this obvious." Nora Bell lowered her head to hide what might have been a smile. My mother rounded on her. "Get out." "No," I said. Everybody looked at me. Nora froze by the sideboard, shoulders up around her ears. I turned to my mother. "She stays." "You wanted witnesses." Celeste's nostrils flared. She was a beautiful woman in the way expensive hotels are beautiful. Controlled, polished, impossible to relax inside. She hated being contradicted in front of staff. Graham hated it too, which was one of the few traits he had inherited honestly. My father braced both hands on the table. "What do you want?" That question would have meant something to me once. A year ago, maybe two. Back when I still mistook recognition for love. Now it sounded procedural. I want to finish, I said. So I did. I showed them the decoy vendor file Graham had discovered on my workstation. A file that had been created from his laptop, not mine, 43 minutes before Martin Keller emailed himself the draft of my resignation. I showed them the metadata. I showed them the embedded author string. I showed them the hidden revision history where someone had forgotten to strip the internal note that read, "Use this set/cleaner version." Martin sank into the nearest chair so abruptly the leather gave a dull groan. My mother stared at the screen and whispered, "Graham." He dragged both hands through his hair. "This proves nothing." "Actually," I said, "it proves premeditation." Then I opened the banking trail. That was where the temperature really dropped. Northline Procurement, the shell vendor they were accusing me of using, had been paid in 6 transfers over 8 months. The public-facing paperwork said custom hardware sourcing, imported fixtures, high-end stone consolidation fees. A lot of words designed to sound boring and expensive. But the routing numbers led somewhere else. To a regional credit union account opened under an LLC registered by a corporate service firm in Delaware. That LLC had one initial signer. I zoomed in. My brother's face lost color with surgical precision. My father didn't speak. He just stared. My mother found her chair behind her and sat down slowly as if the air itself had thickened. "This is fabricated," Graham said, but now his voice was higher. Thinner. "She's been digging through private records." "No," I replied. "I've been following missing money." I scrolled to the next screen. Transfer destination. Second account. Personal use. Property management company in Scottsdale. Lease payment. Car service. Jewelry purchase. Hotel charges in Manhattan. Not a giant movie villain fortune. Just the kind of steady siphoning that only works when everyone assumes the golden son would never have a reason to steal. Then I placed one final document on the table. A trust amendment. Dated March 14th. Signed by Richard Hart, Celeste Hart, and according to the document, me. I slid it toward my mother. "That," I said quietly, "is not my signature." Her eyes flicked over the page, then away. Richard looked at her. "You told me she came in and signed." She didn't answer. Graham stepped in. "Mom was just moving things around because Evelyn has been unstable for months." I almost laughed at that. Unstable. The favorite word of weak men cornered by evidence. Instead I tilted my head. "Would you like me to play the voice memo now, or should I save that for outside counsel?" Martin Keller stood so abruptly his chair rolled back into the credenza. Outside counsel. There was. The phrase they should have been asking about from the beginning. "Yes," I said. "Wine." Nobody spoke. I opened the audio file and pressed play. Static. A clink of glass. Then my mother's voice, soft and unmistakable. "If Evelyn notices the trust adjustment, we'll say Graham handled it. She always protects him." My father, "No. We say she signed. She won't challenge it publicly." Then Martin Keller, lower and more cautious. "You need to move quickly before she gets suspicious." When I stopped the recording, the room felt stripped bare. The fluorescent lighting hummed overhead. Somewhere far below us on Wacker Drive, a siren passed and faded. My father looked at Martin with something very close to hatred. Martin swallowed. "Richard, I assumed." "You assumed what?" I asked. "That I'd keep swallowing it." Graham slammed both hands on the table. "You set us up." I met his gaze. "No. I let you continue." He stared at me as if seeing a stranger wearing my face. And in a way he was. Because the version of me they knew had been built for survival. Quiet competence. Gentle deflection. Clean up the mess. Earn the scraps. Don't embarrass the family. That version had carried Hartren through labor disputes, vendor collapses, and a 6-month permit nightmare while Graham collected magazine features and called himself the architect of our growth. That version had stayed late and fixed his mistakes, then gone home and told herself it didn't matter who got credit as long as the work got done. That version had died slowly. Not in one dramatic moment. In 100 tiny ones. When my mother introduced me at a gala as our practical daughter, and Graham as the visionary. When my father told a client Graham had built the Lakeview expansion that I had actually negotiated line by line. When the board approved Graham's bonus the same week I got a thank you orchid and a speech about loyalty. When I found out the trust distributions had been quietly altered and my mother smiled and told me not to be so sensitive. When I realized that in my family usefulness was the closest thing to love I was ever going to get. The night everything changed was 3 months before that boardroom ambush. It was raining hard enough to silver the windows of my apartment, the kind of March rain that makes the city look as if it has been sanded down to glass and concrete. I was sitting at my kitchen island with my laptop open, half eating cold takeout from Red Crane Noodles, when an internal payment approval crossed my screen by accident. It was a bulk vendor batch for a North Shore project. Nothing unusual except one line item carried an old formatting template only Graham still used. That caught my eye. Then I noticed the billing code. Wrong project. I opened the attached invoice. The logo was clean, the numbers tidy, the language plausible. But the contact phone number routed to a voicemail box with no company name. I checked the business registration. It existed but barely. A paper-thin LC formed 11 months earlier. No website. No actual operating footprint. No prior vendor history with us. Yet we had paid them 6 figures. I remember the exact feeling that went through me then. Not shock. Recognition. Cold and immediate, like stepping barefoot onto marble in winter. Because if Graham had done something reckless, my parents would protect him. And if protecting him required sacrificing me, they would do that too. So I didn't confront anyone. I didn't ask questions. I didn't give them the courtesy of a warning. I started preparing. The next few days I became very quiet. At work I smiled at the right times. I sat through meetings. I let Graham interrupt me. I forwarded market summaries. I approved furniture schedules. At family dinner on Sunday, I passed the rosemary potatoes and listened to my mother praise Graham's instincts, while my father talked over me to ask him about a development in Highland Park I had been negotiating for 6 weeks. I even apologized when Graham snapped at me for correcting a budget number in front of 2 project managers. That apology bought me a lot of room. People never look closely at the person they believe has already accepted their role. At night I built a second life out of evidence. I copied audit logs. I exported access records. I mapped vendor histories against cash flow gaps. I called an old friend from Northwestern Law named Mara Bennett and asked her a question so carefully phrased it probably sounded hypothetical to anyone else. If someone suspects financial misdirection inside a closely held family company, I said, standing in my dark living room while headlights moved across the ceiling, how early is too early to prepare for litigation? Mara didn't laugh. She never laughed at the right things. It's too early, she said, the minute you tell them you know. That was why I hired her 2 days later. I rented a small private office under an LC Graham had never heard of. I backed up records to encrypted storage. I met a forensic accountant named Simon Vale in a cafe on LaSalle where the tables were black stone and the espresso tasted like burnt almonds. Simon was compact, silver-haired, and so dry in manner he made accountants seem theatrical. He looked at my spreadsheets for 12 minutes then asked, "Do you want to prove theft or do you want to prove conspiracy? Is there a difference?" He stirred his coffee once. One sends a person to rehab or church. The other rearranges inheritances. Conspiracy, I said. Good, he replied. Then stop thinking like a daughter. That might have been the first truly useful thing anyone had said to me in years. By the time Graham restored my server credentials in the middle of the night and planted the bait file on my workstation, I had already been tracking him for 11 weeks. He thought he was hunting me. Really, he was stepping exactly where I needed him to step. Back in the boardroom with my mother still staring at the trust document as if refusing to focus might blur it out of existence, I locked my phone and slipped it back into my bag. "I'm leaving now," I said. "You don't get to walk out," my father snapped. "I already have." Graham straightened, anger returning because anger was easier for him than fear. "If you go outside with this, you destroy the company." I paused at the end of the table and looked back at him. "No," I said. "I exposed the part that was already rotten." Then I turned to Martin Keller. "You'll be hearing from Mara Bennett at Bennett Cole before noon. I suggest you retain your own counsel before then." Martin's mouth opened. Closed. Nora Bell stepped aside so quickly she nearly knocked into the coat stand. My mother found her voice just as I reached the door. "Evelyn," she said, and for the first time there was no superiority in it. Only caution. "Don't be impulsive. I rested my hand on the brushed steel handle and looked at her over my shoulder. You all spent years teaching me not to be. Then I walked out. The elevator ride down from the 32nd floor was the calmest I had felt in months. Not because I had one. Not yet. Because the truth had finally moved from my body into the room. I wasn't carrying it alone anymore. When the doors opened into the marble lobby, Mara Bennett was waiting near the revolving doors in a camel coat, one hand around a paper coffee cup, the other holding her phone. She took one look at my face and nodded once. How bad? Bad enough, I said. She handed me the coffee without asking whether I wanted it. Good. Simon's already running the transfer tree. And Evelyn? Yes. Did they say anything especially stupid in front of witnesses? I thought of Martin. The voicemail. Graham thanking me for proving his point. My mother admitting I was expected to protect him. Yes, I said. Her smile was thin and sharp as a paper cut. Excellent. The next 48 hours moved with the strange, suspended clarity that follows impact. At home I slept in bursts and dreams. At the office, or what had once been my office, I was locked out by noon. My building pass stopped working at 12:16. My company email was disabled at 12:19. By 1:05, 3 board members had called to ask if I was taking some time away. By 3:40, a business blog with suspiciously close ties to Graham's golf partner published an item about internal instability at Heartrun Living. They were still trying to get ahead of it. That told Mara exactly what she needed to know. If they thought they could bury this quietly, they wouldn't be spinning, she said that evening, pacing the conference room at Bennett Cole with her jacket draped over one chair. The room smelled faintly of leather and bergamot polish. Outside the windows, Midtown glowed blue-black under a cold spring sky. Spin means liquidity concerns, lender sensitivity, or both. Simon Vale was seated across from me with 2 laptops open, his reading glasses low on his nose. Both, he said. And worse. I found round-trip transfers. Mara stopped pacing. Define worse. Simon clicked a folder open and turned one screen toward us. Northline Procurement doesn't just receive funds. It redistributes them into 3 streams. Personal use, as Evelyn already saw. Secondary shell activity. And debt service. Whose debt? I asked. Simon didn't answer immediately. He enlarged one page instead. There, in tidy rows, were loan references tied to an investment property holding company called Grafton Residential. Registered owner, Graham Hart. Co-guarantor, Richard Hart. Mara let out a slow breath. He used corporate funds to service private debt. Repeatedly, Simon said. And unless I'm missing something, Richard knew. I looked at the screen, then back at the city lights. Somewhere below, traffic moved like thin ribbons of fire. My father had always justified everything with legacy. With stewardship. With the language of building something for the next generation. He liked old words. Heritage. Duty. Permanence. He said them with the solemnity of prayer. Apparently they meant less than protecting Graham's ego. Mara leaned both palms on the conference table. We have them on internal fraud, forged trust modification, wrongful termination attempt, and potentially bank misrepresentation if those company statements were used in covenant reporting. I said, what happens next? He gave me a level look. Now we make them come somewhere they can't control. That somewhere was not court. Not yet. 3 days later at 9 a.m., my parents and Graham arrived at Bennett Cole LLP for what Martin Keller had insisted on calling a private family resolution meeting. Mara let him keep the phrase because she enjoyed traps almost as much as I did. The main conference room was everything people imagine when they picture institutional authority. Gleaming walnut table. High-backed leather chairs. Frosted glass walls veined with light from the city-facing windows. A bowl of white orchids on the sideboard that looked too perfect to be real. The air held the clean, expensive silence of places where people sign documents that alter the shape of their lives. I was already seated when they entered. Not at the end of the table. Not in the middle. At Mara's right hand. That mattered more than I can explain. My father came in first, wearing a dark suit I'd only seen him use for funerals and lender meetings. His posture was still rigid, but the confidence from the boardroom had thinned. My mother followed in cream silk and pearls, the kind of armor she reached for when she wanted the room to remember breeding before facts. Graham entered last, jaw shadowed, tie crooked, eyes bloodshot from either rage or lack of sleep. With them came Martin Keller and a white-shoed litigation partner from his firm named Douglas Reeve, whose expression suggested he had spent the last 2 days being unpleasantly surprised. No one greeted me. Mara stood. "Good morning. I'm Mara Bennett. Before we begin, I want to be clear that this is a confidential pre-litigation meeting, but no one here should confuse confidentiality with protection from regulatory or criminal exposure should we fail to reach an agreement." Douglas Reeve pulled out a chair with too much force. "That sounds theatrical." "Then try not to give me material," Mara said. I almost smiled. Graham's eyes found me and held there. He was trying to summon the old dynamic, the one where eye contact from him still felt like judgment. It didn't. Not anymore. He looked tired. Smaller somehow. Like expensive fabric pulled too tight across bad framing. My father sat opposite me. My mother lowered herself beside him and arranged her folder parallel to the table edge. Graham remained standing until Douglas told him to sit. He dropped into the chair and said, "Can we stop pretending she's some kind of victim?" Mara opened a binder. "We can, yes. Once we've finished establishing that she's a whistleblower." Douglas Reeve leaned back. "On what basis?" "Several," Mara replied. "Mr. Vale." Simon stood from the side chair near the screen, remote in hand. The first slide came up behind him. Heartrun Living/transfer chain summary. Underneath it, columns. Dates. Accounts. Routing paths. Amounts. Each line cool and merciless. If Act 1 had been about shock, this was about structure. This was where chaos got pinned down to calendar dates and invoice numbers. Where instinct lost to sequence. Simon spoke without flourish. Over the last 11 months, Heartrun Living issued 6 direct payments and 9 adjusted reimbursements to a vendor called Northline Procurement. That entity is a pass-through shell with no operational footprint, no warehouse capacity, and no legitimate sourcing activity. Funds routed from Northline to several endpoints, including a vehicle lease, a Scottsdale residential holding company, and debt service for Grafton Residential. He clicked. Next slide. Property records. Loan statements. Internal approvals. Device authentication logs. Every item appeared in order. Not dramatic. Just undeniable. Graham interrupted on the third slide. "This is nonsense. Correlation isn't proof." Simon inclined his head. "Correct. Which is why the next file matters." He clicked again. A DocuSign integrity report appeared, followed by device metadata. My forged trust amendment. My signature. The location stamp. The originating hardware fingerprint. Not me. Graham. Actually worse. Graham using my father's office iPad. My mother's fingers tightened so hard around her pen I thought it might snap. Richard looked at Graham slowly. "You told us Keller had all that prepared." "I did," Graham said too quickly. Martin reviewed it." He said. Martin Keller lifted both hands. "I reviewed a final document package. I did not conduct forensic verification." Mara said, "That omission will interest the bar, I imagine." Douglas shot Martin a look of open disgust. I sat back and watched the architecture of denial begin to sag. Simon continued. "Now for timeline." This was the part one had wanted them to see most. Not just that Graham stole. Not just that my parents lied. But that they planned. The screen filled with a horizontal bar broken into dates. March 14th, forged trust amendment. March 22nd, audit permissions quietly altered. April 3rd, first internal discussions about shifting project oversight away from me. May 9th, Graham emails Martin Keller regarding containment language. June through August, shell vendor payments accelerate. September 18th, lender reporting submitted with manipulated operating statements. October 1st, key staff excluded from reconciliation review. October 27th, false vendor file drafted. Last Tuesday, voicemail regarding moving quickly before I got suspicious. 2 nights ago, 2:13 a.m., my credentials restored and bait file placed. The room went very still. Premeditation does not always announce itself with malice. Sometimes it looks like a row of dates in black font against a white screen. A calendar turned into a blade. Douglas Reeve rubbed one hand over his mouth. "Richard," he said quietly, Is there anything else I need to know before I continue sitting here? My father did not answer. Mara folded her hands. There is actually. She turned slightly. Vanessa. The door opened behind them. Vanessa Lynn walked in wearing a dark green sheath dress and carrying a laptop bag. Graham twisted in his chair so fast the wheels squealed against the floor. Vanessa had been his executive assistant for 3 years. Everyone assumed she worshipped him because she anticipated his moods, managed his calendar, shielded him from consequences, and laughed at his weaker jokes in front of clients. Graham trusted her with everything because men like my brother often mistake attentive women for loyal ones. What he never noticed was who trained Vanessa. I taught her how to build executive schedule mirrors, how to classify travel, how to preserve version histories when someone wanted a record to disappear. I taught her what real leadership looked like too, though I didn't realize it at the time. She took the empty chair beside Simon and set a stack of printed emails on the table. Graham stood. What is she doing here? Helping, I said. No, he snapped. No. Absolutely not. She works for me. Vanessa's expression didn't change. Not anymore. My mother looked between us, trying to recover the social script. Vanessa, I'm sure you're confused about what's happening. Vanessa met her gaze. I'm not confused, Mrs. Hart. I'm tired. Then she opened her laptop. The next 40 minutes were devastating in a way only administrative detail can be. Vanessa had meeting notes, calendar blocks, travel reclassifications, screen captures of Graham instructing her to bury the Northline noise. A forwarded message from Martin Keller's office with subject line, language for Evelyn's separation. A voice memo Graham had sent late one night from the back of a car, drunk enough to be careless, laughing as he said, "She'll take the hit. She always does." Graham looked at her as if betrayal was something only other people were capable of. Why, he said. Vanessa closed the laptop and answered with perfect calm. Because when my mother was in the hospital last winter, Evelyn covered my payroll error before you could fire me for it. Because she trained me and you used me. Because I listened while you joked about ruining her. And because you're not half as smart as you think you are. That landed with almost elegant precision. Douglas Reeve removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. Martin Keller stared down at the table. My mother's pearl earring trembled slightly as she turned toward Graham. My father's face had gone the color of old paper. Then the fracture finally widened. Richard slapped one hand on the table and looked at Graham. You told me this was a temporary transfer issue. You told me you had outside investment tied up. Graham barked out a laugh that had no humor in it. Oh, so now this is all me. Right. You guaranteed Grafton. You signed the reporting. Mom signed the trust transfer. Martin drafted the damn exit papers. Lower your voice, my mother hissed. Why, he shot back. Because the staff might hear. Douglas Reeve stood. I need 5 minutes alone with my clients. Mara didn't move. You can have 3 after we finish. He stared at her. That is not how this works. It is today. I let the implications settle over the room. Graham looked at me again. Not furious now. Not exactly. Something uglier. Something shocked. The shock of a man raised to believe the world bends around him, discovering, too late, that one person he dismissed has been quietly redrawing the map. He said my name like an accusation. You planned this? Yes. My father turned toward me. For how long? Long enough, I said, to make sure you'd find exactly what I wanted you to find. Mara's mouth curved by half an inch. She appreciated a well-placed line. Graham made a sharp, disbelieving sound. You wanted us to frame you. I wanted proof of intent, I said. You were generous enough to provide it. My mother whispered, how could you do this to your own family? That question might have broken me once. In another version of my life, maybe I would have folded in on myself trying to answer it. Trying to explain pain in a language they would accept. Instead, I folded my hands on the table. You mean the family that forged my name, moved my trust, tried to terminate me for a fraud Graham committed, and planned the statement before inviting me into that boardroom. Celeste opened her mouth, then shut it. Mara took over. We are prepared to file civil claims by noon if necessary, she said. Fraud, conspiracy, wrongful termination, defamation, breach of fiduciary duty, trust interference and related counts. We are also prepared to notify Hartran's primary lender and the relevant authorities regarding falsified reporting and transfer irregularities. However, my client is willing to resolve this without public filing if the following conditions are met. She slid a document packet across the table. Douglas snatched it first. His eyes moved faster with every page. My father said, "What conditions?" Mara listed them the way some people recite weather. No emphasis. No anger. No room. Immediate written retraction of all allegations against Evelyn Hart. Immediate restoration of her reputation in board minutes and external communications. Her full separation from Hartran with compensation equal to withheld distributions, unpaid incentive amounts and damages. Transfer of sole ownership in Hartran's Lakeshore Sourcing Division, including its existing contracts and operating staff. Removal of Graham Hart from all financial authority effective immediately. Full cooperation with a neutral forensic review. Resignation of Martin Keller as counsel on all trust matters. And signed affidavits preserving evidence related to March 14th through this week. Richard stared at her. "You're gutting the company." "No," Mara said. "We're salvaging the part that can survive." Graham laughed again, louder this time. "She can't run Lakeshore." I finally looked directly at him. "I already do." That was true. Lakeshore sourcing had been my work from the beginning. Vendor relationships, cost engineering, salvage partnerships, international customs cleanups. The entire machinery that actually kept projects profitable. Graham had presented it at conferences twice and could not have negotiated a single one of its freight terms without a handler. My father knew that. Which was why the thing that moved across his face then was not outrage. It was calculation. That hurt more than I expected even after everything. Because for one naked second, I saw him not as a father defending his son, but as a businessman measuring loss. Weighing whether sacrificing Graham was now the cheaper option. Graham saw it too. He stood up so violently his chair toppled backward onto the carpet. "You can't be serious." Richard didn't answer. "Dad." Still nothing. My mother reached for Richard's sleeve. "Say something." He pulled free. The room had reached the point where truth stops feeling moral and starts feeling logistical. Sign or fight. Operate or sink. Love no longer entering the calculation at all. Douglas Reeve looked up from the packet. If the lender exposure is real, public litigation could trigger covenant acceleration. "It is real," Simon said. Douglas turned to Richard. "Then your choices are limited." Graham stared at him. "You're supposed to be on our side." Douglas's expression went flat. "I'm on the side of not going down with criminally stupid clients." Martin Keller muttered, "Jesus." My mother's composure finally cracked. "You all act as if this was some monstrous plot. Families make internal adjustments all the time." "Forgery is not an adjustment," Mara said. Celeste looked at me then, and for the first time in my life I saw uncertainty in her without a trace of performance. "Evelyn," she said softly, "if you do this, there is no coming back." I thought of all the years I had spent trying to come back to places I was never truly welcome. Sunday dinners where I was tolerated as long as I was useful. Holidays where Graham got crystal decanters and I got practical scarves. Board retreats where my work became his language. Then I thought of my apartment, my files, my own name finally resting in my own hands. "There isn't," I agreed. And then I gave her the line I had carried into that room like a blade. "You were right. I was never going to be as good as Graham." Everyone waited. I held her gaze. I had to become something far more dangerous. No one spoke after that. Douglas conferred quietly with Richard in the corner near the windows. Celeste sat with her spine too straight, hands locked around each other so tightly the knuckles blanched. Graham paced along the sideboard beneath the orchids, muttering to himself, then to Martin, then to no one. Vanessa sat still watching the city. Simon sorted exhibits into neat stacks. Mara wrote 2 notes on a yellow legal pad and slid one to me. "You all right?" I wrote back, "Better now." 10 minutes later, Richard returned to the table looking older than he had that morning. Not softer. Just older. As if the bright lines of his self-image had been rubbed away with a rough cloth. "We'll sign the retraction and the review," he said. "The division transfer needs discussion." Mara didn't blink. "No." Douglas said, "Mara." She didn't look at him. My client built the only functioning profit center in your collapsing structure. You don't get to steal the engine and offer her the fumes. Graham slammed one palm against the sideboard. This is extortion. No, I said quietly. This is the invoice. He turned toward me. His face was flushed now, eyes bright, tie hanging open. All the polish gone. He looked like a boy who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. You think you've won? I think, I said, you should ask your assistant whether she saved the Zurich call too. Vanessa glanced over. I did. Graham went utterly still. That was the moment he broke. Not dramatically. Not with shouting. He just sagged as if some invisible cable inside him had finally snapped. He lowered himself into the chair Douglas had vacated and stared at the table, hands hanging between his knees. My father closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he said very quietly, "Give us the papers." The signing itself was strangely mundane. A fountain pen. A stack of documents. The soft drag of paper over walnut. Initial here. Sign here. Acknowledge here. Martin Keller refused at first to sign the trust preservation affidavit until Mara reminded him in a voice smooth as poured steel that refusal would be interpreted as spoliation risk. He signed. Celeste signed with controlled elegance, each stroke perfectly shaped even while the tendon in her neck fluttered. Richard's signature was heavier, indented deep enough to mark the next page. Graham hesitated longest over the financial authority resignation. His hand hovered, trembled once, then dropped. When it was done, Mara collected the packet, tapped the stack into alignment and slid a copy to Douglas. There, she said. Now you can all begin having the separate conversations you should have had before trying to bury my client. No one thanked her. They stood slowly the way people stand after hearing a verdict they already know they deserve. My mother reached for her bag without looking at me. Martin Keller left first, face bloodless. Douglas lingered only long enough to say to Richard, "Do not destroy anything," in the tone of a man speaking to a patient who keeps chewing through stitches. Graham was last. He paused at the door and turned back toward me. The morning light through the frosted glass had shifted warmer by then, thinning the hard edge of the room. He looked older too. Not because he had suffered enough to change. Because he had been seen clearly at last. "I'm still your brother," he said. It was almost laughable, that timing. That instinct. To reach for blood only when power had failed. I stood, picked up my coat and walked toward him. Not too close. Just enough to make sure he heard me and no one else had to translate. "Next time," I said, "make sure the woman managing your calendar isn't working for both sides." Then I went around him and out into the hall. The first morning in my new apartment smelled like cedar and coffee. It was 6 weeks later, and sunlight was coming through the tall industrial windows in long gold bands, warming the exposed brick above the breakfast counter and turning the chrome fixtures on the stove almost white. My mugs were still stacked on the floor because I hadn't decided which cabinet felt right. There were 2 unopened boxes near the balcony door labeled books and winter coats, and a small fig tree on the sill that was either thriving or politely refusing to die. I stood barefoot on the wood floor with a ceramic cup in my hand and let myself enjoy the absurd luxury of an ordinary, peaceful morning. No emergency calls. No family texts demanding emotional labor dressed up as duty. No board packets. No expectation. Just coffee. Sunlight. Silence. The legal and financial aftermath had unfolded with the grim efficiency of consequences finally denied no more. Hartran Living announced an internal leadership restructuring 3 days after the signing. The statement was vague enough to preserve vanity, but not vague enough to shield me. My name was explicitly cleared of wrongdoing, and the release credited me with developing the Lakeshore division now operating independently under my ownership. Trade publications picked it up. So did the lender, which triggered an audit. So did 2 former employees who suddenly remembered things they had been too intimidated to say out loud before. Graham lost everything first. His authority, obviously. His title. His company car. Access to the executive floor. The board removed him from formal operations before the month was out. Then the lenders came looking. Then the tax questions followed. Then the Scottsdale property surfaced in ways that made him impossible to defend publicly. The man who had spent a decade curating himself as a visionary heir ended up taking meetings with second-tier defense counsel in wrinkled shirts, trying to explain why shell companies kept appearing around his name like flies around fruit. My father lost slower, which suited the scale of his arrogance. He kept his seat for a while. Men like Richard Hart always do. Respectability has inertia. But once the forensic review confirmed lender misreporting and governance failures, the social cost began nibbling at the edges of everything he valued. His invitation to chair the Lake Forest Preservation Fund quietly lapsed. A banking dinner he had hosted every spring for 12 years suddenly went ahead without him. At the Union League, people still shook his hand, but they did it with the distracted courtesy reserved for men already being discussed elsewhere. My mother's fall was more delicate and therefore more devastating. Celeste Hart did not lose money first. She lost audience. The Women's Arts Circle asked her to step back temporarily from programming leadership. The gala committee she had controlled like a private kingdom replaced her with a younger woman who wore flats and said community impact too often. Friends who had laughed over champagne while she compared me unfavorably to Graham began sending clipped, careful messages about misunderstandings and praying for healing. The women who once orbited her at charity auctions began drifting toward brighter constellations. Turns out social power is just another trust fund. Once confidence in the management disappears, the value collapses quickly. Martin Keller resigned from 2 estate boards and stopped returning calls from at least half the city. I heard through Mara that the bar inquiry was unpleasant. Douglas Reeve survived because smart sharks usually do. He also sent Mara a bottle of wine with a note that read, "Next time I'd prefer less theater." She framed the note in her office. As for the people who enabled Graham in smaller ways, their consequences arrived with proportionate precision. His golf friend and media whisperer Lance Mercer lost a consulting contract after a client discovered he had been planting gossip tied to internal disputes. A project controller who had rubber-stamped suspicious approvals was demoted into a back-office role so irrelevant even his LinkedIn enthusiasm dried up. 2 board members who had treated me like decorative support during meetings found themselves gently excluded from the new vendor alliance once Lakeshore spun out under my control. Consequences I learned rarely thunder and all at once. More often they gather like a tide and keep rising. The messages started in week 2. First, Graham. You've made your point. Then, call me before this goes further. Then at 1:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. I know you're angry, but there are parents. I archived every one. My mother's texts were more intricate. Nostalgia wrapped around accusation. The house feels strange without you. Whatever happened between you and Graham, this family is still your family. I miss who you used to be. That one sat on my screen for a long time before I archived it too. My father called only twice. He left one voicemail. "Evelyn," he said, voice clipped as if brevity could restore authority, "there are practical matters requiring discussion. Call my office." Not Dad. Not Richard. My office. I did not call back. The only message that almost reached me was an email from Celeste with the subject line Sunday dinner. Inside was one line. "The family isn't the same." I stared at that for a minute, then moved it to a folder Mara jokingly labeled archaeology. Because that was what it all was by then. Sediment. Old structures. Fossils of a life I had mistaken for destiny. Lakeshore, meanwhile, became real in a way it never had under Hartran's shadow. The division transfer gave me the contracts, the staff I requested, and a clean operational spine. What it did not give me was confidence handed from outside. That part one had to build myself. But once I stopped spending energy trying to be palatable, I discovered how much I actually had. I rented a smaller office in River North with polished concrete floors, matte black shelving, and windows that caught the late afternoon sun. Kept the team lean. Vanessa Lynn came with me 3 weeks after the settlement, which surprised absolutely no one except Graham. I made her operations director on the spot. Nora Bell joined us a month later after sending a 2-line email that said, "If you're building something honest, I'd rather work there." We called the new company Quiet Ledger Advisory. Mara said the name sounded ominous. Simon said it sounded accurate. I liked both of those reactions. At first, we specialized in supply chain recovery and forensic sourcing reviews because that was the cleanest bridge from what I knew. But very quickly the calls changed. Women pushed out of family businesses. Minority partners frozen out by informal governance. Founders whose trusted relatives had turned their access into entitlement. People who had spent years being told they were overreacting to missing money, Altered paperwork, strategic humiliations, quiet theft. Apparently there was a market for someone who could read the room and the ledger at the same time. I didn't market myself as a revenge specialist. That would have been cheap. I marketed precision. Which, in the end, was more frightening to the right people anyway. One Thursday afternoon in early autumn, Vanessa stood in my office doorway holding 2 iced coffees and wearing the faintly wicked expression that meant she had gossip. "You won't believe who I just saw," she said. I looked up from a draft engagement letter. That sentence rarely ends well for someone. It definitely doesn't today. She handed me the coffee. "Graham. At the Federal Center. With a lawyer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else." I took the cup and leaned back in my chair. Outside, the sky over the river was a pale silver blue, and light flashed off the neighboring glass towers in sharp, clean planes. How did he look? Vanessa considered. Like expensive milk left out too long. I laughed. Actually laughed. Not bitterly. Just because the image was perfect. She dropped into the visitor chair and kicked off her shoes. That was one of my favorite things about her. The speed with which she became comfortable once a room was safe. "Also," she added, "your mother apparently tried to get herself reappointed to the gala board. And someone leaked the minutes from the governance review." I raised an eyebrow. Vanessa lifted both hands. "I didn't do it. That is not a denial. It is a spiritual denial." I shook my head and took a sip of coffee. There were people who would probably find that kind of conversation cruel. A sign I had become hard. Maybe I had in some ways. But hardness is not always damage. Sometimes it is shape. Sometimes it is the clean edge you finally allow yourself after spending years being sanded down for other people's comfort. The friendship that survived all of it, strangely enough, was not one I had expected. Not my parents, obviously. Not Graham. Not even some childhood ally from the family orbit. It was Vanessa. A woman who had once carried my brother's coffee, managed his lies, and sat outside his office while he explained me to rooms I wasn't invited into. By all appearances she had belonged to his side of the board. But history is never as simple as seating arrangements. She knew what it was to be underestimated in expensive rooms. She knew what it was to be praised only when useful. She knew the peculiar exhaustion of smiling through disrespect until one day you simply decide not to. We didn't become friends in a dramatic movie way. No tearful confession. No overnight intimacy. It happened through work. Long nights. Shared instincts. Mutual respect built out of accuracy. The occasional late glass of wine while reviewing impossible clients. The kind of trust that grows best after both people have seen what the other looks like under pressure. 6 months after the confrontation at Bennett Cole, we took the staff to dinner at a small Mediterranean place in West Loop called Astor House. Dark green tile. Brass sconces. Warm bread arriving in linen. The windows reflected the amber light back at us so the whole room looked dipped in honey. At some point during dessert, Nora Bell raised her glass and said, "To the most terrifyingly calm woman I've ever worked for." Vanessa clinked hers against mine. "Seconded." I smiled. "You make me sound impossible." "No," Nora said. "Capable." That word stayed with me longer than I expected. Because capable was never the identity my family assigned me. Useful, yes. Reliable. Sensible. Practical. The daughter who handled details. The daughter who made things work. The daughter who should be grateful for a seat near the wall while her brother took center stage. Capable though. Capable means self-defining. It means the skill belongs to you, not to the system that exploited it. By winter, the last pieces of my old life had finished falling away. I stopped checking whether my parents had called. I stopped drafting replies I would never send. I stopped hearing my mother's voice every time I made a decision for myself. The body learns freedom slower than the mind. But it does learn. Then one evening, nearly a year after that boardroom ambush, I found myself on my balcony as the sun went down behind the city. The sky was a wash of orange and rose fading into blue. The windows of the neighboring high-rises caught the last light and held it for a moment, like embers behind glass. Far below, traffic murmured through the streets, soft and continuous. I had a blanket over the back of my chair, a good bottle of wine open on the table between 2 glasses, and a small plate of olives and pecorino going untouched because the air was too beautiful to interrupt. Vanessa stepped out carrying her glass and handed me the second one. To anyone who had known us a year earlier, The sight might have seemed unlikely. My brother's former assistant and the daughter he tried to bury, standing shoulder to shoulder under a warm autumn sky, trading stories about impossible clients and broken systems and what counts as loyalty once illusion has burned off. But some of the best things in my life began as misread details. Vanessa leaned on the railing and looked out over the city lights starting to prick through the dusk. Do you ever think about answering them? She didn't have to specify who. I swirled the wine once and watched the last band of light slide off the rooftops. Sometimes. And then I remember that closure is not a group project. She laughed softly. That's going in the company handbook. We stood there for a while without speaking. The air smelled faintly of rain coming and distant chimney smoke. Somewhere nearby, a train rumbled across elevated tracks with that low metallic shiver that always makes Chicago feel like it's breathing in its sleep. Eventually Vanessa said, "For what it's worth, if none of that had happened, I'd still be outside Graham's office pretending his emergencies mattered more than my life." I turned toward her. The orange edge of sunset had softened into a dim gold rim behind her hair. "If none of that had happened," I said, "I'd still be trying to earn a seat at a table I built." She lifted her glass. "To badly chosen tables." I touched mine to hers. "To leaving them." The small clean sound of crystal meeting crystal felt more final than any court order. I used to think strength looked like endurance. Like staying calm through insult. Like making yourself smaller than the damage so you could pass through it. And to some extent that had saved me. Composure was never weakness. Not really. It was the first tool I had. But now I understand there's a difference between composure and surrender. The woman I was back then believed that if she worked hard enough, stayed gracious enough, absorbed enough disrespect without flinching, someone would eventually call it love. She thought loyalty was noble even when it was one-sided. She thought being needed was the same as being valued. The woman I am now knows better. I know that restraint is power only when it serves your dignity, not someone else's comfort. I know that silence can be strategy, but it can also be a cage if you stay in it too long. I know that people who laugh while diminishing you are often measuring how much of yourself you're willing to give away to stay in the room. And I know something else too, something I would never have admitted in the middle of all that grief. Part of me is grateful. Not for the cruelty. Not for the forgery. Not for the years of comparison and deliberate smallness. But for the clarity. Because once they pushed hard enough to reveal themselves fully, I stopped confusing hope with evidence. I stopped waiting for fairness from people who needed my obedience more than my happiness. I stopped trying to become acceptable to a system designed around my diminishment. If my parents had loved me more gently, perhaps I would have stayed. If Graham had been less arrogant, perhaps he would have hidden the rot longer. If they had treated me a little better, maybe I never would have discovered how much power I had when I stopped asking for permission to use it. So yes, in the quietest part of myself I thank them. I thank my mother for that small cruel laugh in the boardroom. I thank my father for teaching me exactly how power behaves when it thinks it's safe. I thank my brother for believing I was weak enough to frame and vain enough not to prepare. They were the fire. I became what survived it. Vanessa set her empty glass down and nudged the bottle toward me for a refill. The city below us had turned fully to light now, thousands of lit windows suspended in the dark like a second sky. I poured for both of us. "Any regrets?" she asked. I thought about it honestly. About the family house I no longer visited. About the old holiday rituals. About my mother's polished dining table and my father's library and the version of home I had spent so many years trying to rescue from the people inside it. Then I thought about this balcony. This company. This peace. This life built out of earned things instead of inherited expectations. "No," I said. And I meant it. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't about making people suffer. It's about becoming untouchable by the version of you they thought they owned. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about hurting them back. It's about building a life so solid, so honest, and so fully your own that their opinion can never reach the foundation again.